Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ideal 21, the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility for Learning Conference. Thanks for joining us today. I am absolutely thrilled to have everyone that registered here. We have about just over 300 people coming in today, and I'm sure that number will pick up throughout the day. And that is really heartening for me to know that there are over 300 of you out there that are interested in this conference, in this topic, in this event. It's really important for me as a community builder, as somebody who is looking for including everybody in the kinds of conversations that TLDC has. This means a lot. So I really appreciate you registering and being here today. So thank you very much. I wanted to start out a little bit before I introduce Megan and Jess. I wanted to just talk a little bit about why this event exists. And it's kind of important for me so that you sort of understand the background of even what TLDC is about. As you know, this year, and because of the pandemic, it had to switch to doing, virtual events. Originally, TLDC was a live event thing, back when Brent and I were working together. We used to produce one big live event every year, and that was fun. But then we switched we had to switch to all virtual events. And this year in particular, earlier in the summer, we had that event on inclusion and accessibility, and that had a really big impact on me. And I really started to have to reconsider the types of events I was producing. And this topic really came up. And as I was building it, I was starting to ask myself questions about what this community was about, what I'm about, just all of these different things. And, I'm the son of a migrant worker. My dad was a farmer. I used to, drive out to the fields in the central coast of California and wait for him while he worked all day and, listen to his Beach Boys soundtrack. And, while he would be out harvesting lettuce and celery and things like that. And he was always fighting for inclusion, not just inclusion for the men that were working for him, even at restaurants, at hotels, just as they would go through from Bakersfield to Salinas to all over Southern California. I just remember that was always a topic for him. And I do have pictures of him with Cesar Chavez. He was a friend of Cesar Chavez, and it was just it wasn't a big deal to me back then, just not really knowing what was going on, but it really did stick with me, and it's continued through. And as I work through building TLDC, that's the reason why I feel like I need to continue focusing on themes like DEIA and gathering other interested people in this, because it's important to me. And so with that, here are two other folks that are important to me as well, because Megan and Jess both this year they've spoke twice at events that we've had in the past. I think it was the Women in L&D event, and then also another one I can't recall exactly. But they are leaders in the L&D space, people I totally look to for guidance for things. And I'm so excited that they're going to be opening up today. So I want to introduce Megan and Jess from Torrance Learning, and you guys are going to be talking about L&D's role in cultivating racial equity in the workplace. So with that, I'll let you take it away, and I'm going to disappear.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you so much for sharing about your father and how you intersect with this work. I am always inspired by how many of us come into diversity, equity, inclusion work from our different perspectives. And even Megan, when we talk about how you've come into this work as a woman in leadership, I'm really excited for today's conversation. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to kick off this conversation today, and we hope that this is going to be really engaging. So we hope that you really use that chat, ask us questions. We have a few questions that we have for you, but we want to ground in the fact that this conversation is not just about designing a DEIB or DEIA course. It's how we take an equity perspective or framework and apply it to everything else that we do. So we're going to talk about our personal socialization and how we navigate the world based on the bodies that we hold, the identities that we hold, and what biases we might have as a result of that. We'll talk about some impactful anti-racist decisions that you can make in your instructional design to make it more equitable. We're going to talk about some strategies and give you some resources, and then we'll ultimately just be able to work more effectively across lines of difference together based off of where we are and where we're positioned. So welcome. We're excited to kick off the day. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Megan. Oh, you're on mute, Megan.
There we go. All right. So hi there. Thanks, Jess, and welcome everyone, and thank you, Luis, and to the planning committee for pulling this space together and this opportunity to talk about these things. I'm the CEO and founder at Torrance Learning, the founder of the XAPI Learning Cohort. I've done a lot of work in both XAPI and Agile project management. Work with Jess on the CREW, the Cultivating Racial Equity in the Workplace product. And I'm a facilitator at eCornell in their Women's Executive Leadership and the Psychology of Leadership curricula. When Jess talks about, right, so when somebody says, what do you do? That's what I do a lot of things, right? When I was first launched out into the professional world in the early 90s, right? I was going through college in the 80s, and we didn't talk about diversity, or at least I was told that the most polite thing I could do was to not call out people's differences. Right? So that was the framing that I had coming into the workplace. And I wanted to succeed in a male normed, white normed corporate American environment. And so calling out my areas of difference from that would put me at a disadvantage. So I spent a lot of time not talking about a lot of things. I spent a lot of time talking about what it means to be a woman, because that is something I resonate with. But when racial equity protests really got started last year, or restarted, right? It's not like there was anything new necessarily. I found myself without the language to engage in the ways that I wanted to. And fortunately, I already had Jessica on our team at Torrance Learning and had an opportunity to learn so much from her based on her experience and her education. So Jess, can you share us a little bit more about who you are and how you come to this?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess. I like to say I'm a community architect with heart. And so I have been studying social stratification, intergroup dialogue, and being a diversity peer educator probably for about 15, 16 years now. It is not something that diversity, equity, and inclusion, like Louise talked about, right? Like it's something that is a part of my legacy, right? Like these are the things that my people, my ancestors have been fighting for over time. And I have a shared passion with my community. And I like to facilitate community around that knowledge and that education and growth. So this is not something that I think a lot of times folks get thrown into. This is something that I have cultivated, and that's why I'm so passionate about helping everyone else cultivate their understanding of difference and understanding of how that difference paints our experience and our lived experience and our work experience and the work products that we create. But I have a background in teaching, a background in working with large organizations to develop strategy around equity, to create impact. And I also have certifications in intergroup dialogue and facilitating difficult conversations across lines of difference, right? So that we can get through the tough stuff that we might not know. I say that as a caveat and a disclosure because I do hold a lot of marginal identities. And we're going to talk about what marginalized and historically centered means later. And we'll talk about social identity. But I'm not in this position just because I'm a queer woman of color, right? It's because this has been cultivated over time. It is an educational framework that I've developed. And we don't want you to leave this space or this conversation today thinking about how you can tokenize another person from a marginalized group to lead this work. So we do always want to center with that and ground with that this is about 15 years in the making from my perspective. And that's why I'm so excited to help us all kind of learn and grow and cultivate on our own journey.
So this is TLDC, right? Let's start with the conversation. What makes this all so challenging? So go ahead and in the chat, take a couple minutes and let's see what comes out. What makes DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging so challenging? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Some good stuff, right? So not knowing what we don't know, right? Those gaps in our perception. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. Jess, what do you see?
I think the reluctance to talk about it, right? Probably because folks are afraid of the things that they don't know. And I really, the pervasive in society, I think a lot of this work is about unpacking how exclusion has been ingrained in everything. So I appreciate, like, that means we have to unpack and peel a lot of things. The cancel culture, right? That feeds into that fear of, I don't want to get this wrong. Responsibility. We don't want to frame it for folks or sugarcoat it for the majority. Yeah, these are really great. These are really, really, really great. I think the organizational cultures and what does lines of power and resistance and resourcing look like, those are really great contributions. Thanks you all for engaging.
So by asking this question, right, we're opening up this space, right, that gap in which we can learn, right? It's that learning edge, that uncomfortable spot to acknowledge that. And so I want to thank you all for acknowledging that. And I resonated with so many of those concepts and still do, right? And still do. So what Jess and I want to do today is talk about things in 3 parts. Now, I am not saying that this is as easy as 1, 2, 3, or there's 3 easy steps to racial equity. Poof, you're done. Rather, instructional designer to instructional designer, we're doing this in chunks. These are 3 chunks of many things and many actions. But we found that this framework is really helpful. And keep in mind as we engage here today that there are many other things you can do along with some of the activities and the practices that we're going to share with you today.
Yeah.
How do we frame this up relative to some other areas of marginalization?
Yeah, so if we want to go, when we think about what we're using, this conversation is centered and framed for race. But the analysis that we take is all around understanding power differentials, right? And how that is at play in the workplace. So we can also apply this to any perspective that might be experiencing marginalization or exclusion or barriers due to their social identity group. So we're going to center it on a conversation of racial equity. But if we want to talk in, we believe that racial equity is intersectional, meaning that we understand that, like, women of color, for example, have different experiences than men of color, right? And so we hope that you can take some of these conversations and apply them to various perspectives and not just centered on race as we grow. With that, I really appreciate how we talk about our 3 chunks, right? Like, we're instructional designers. We're thinking about strategically, how do folks learn? And a lot of what you're calling out in the chat around what makes this so difficult is that I'm afraid of making a mistake. Well, that's kind of contrary to learning, right? Like how we're gonna make mistakes. So I want to name and start today recognizing that we all make mistakes. We recently presented and we were referencing a book called Blind Spot, which is all around bias. And we got flagged for that being ableist language, right? And those were some perspectives that we hadn't considered. Even if we were talking about a reference, it still was something to consider in our conversation. And that normalizing that we're all going to make mistakes and that we're all in this to learn together, I think is the first step to anything that we do. And what we can guarantee, although we can't guarantee that this is going to be super comfortable, right? Megan talked about being on the learning edge. When you're on your learning edge, you're not comfortable. You're like really, you're tiptoeing in, there's unfamiliar territory. But what we try to cultivate instead of that comfort is some psychological safety, right? How can we engage together in a way that we're going to facilitate growth and that we understand and have this kind of common ground that we're here to learn together? So usually, and this is a meta activity, because usually when we open up these conversations, we recognize and acknowledge that we're all coming to them with different experiences and different needs, right? And so as we come to them, setting norms or agreements in the opening, like right before you dive in, is going to be really necessary to cultivating that safe space and that psychological safety. So essentially you're getting your group to say, hey, these are the things that we can agree to as conversations get heated. So for us, our big three that we usually talk about is acknowledging your triggers. So like we said, everybody is coming to the space with different experience levels and different perspectives. And there may be things that come up that feel triggering. We want to name that those experiences and feelings are valid. And you have the right to take your own breath and step away as you need. Acknowledge your triggers, be honest about your triggers. If you're in a place that you're able to express your trigger in a respectful way, we welcome that. But do what you need to do to take care of you. The second thing is that we hope that folks, because we're all coming from different perspectives, we hope that we all are willing and able to widen our perspective, widen our lenses, right? Sometimes Megan and I have very different lived experiences, like the way that Megan's like, it's not respectful to talk about race, right? It's not respectful to talk about difference in work settings. Well, I exist in a body where I show up. If I'm in a majority white culture, that difference is there, right? Like it's not something I can ignore. So we have very different lived experiences around what we consider respectful, right? For me, it feels disrespectful for you to ignore the fact that I'm the only person of color in the room, right? So us coming together and widening our perspectives and listening to each other so that we can come to that common ground is something that we try to facilitate and hold in these spaces. And then as we talk and discuss, those differences are going to bubble up, right? Those perspective differences are going to bubble up. Those differences in experiences are going to bubble up. We hope that we can all navigate those differences respectfully and acknowledge that, like, hey, maybe chat isn't the best place to hold a debate on those differences because perceptions of what you're typing might not be consistent with what's you're actually typing, right? So those are kind of our big three agreements that we like to hold. If you want to give us a reaction, a thumbs up, if you can agree to those norms today and how we're going to engage together, and then throw in chat if you have any other things that you need. But this is a great exercise to open up difficult conversations with groups so that we can all happen safely together.
Awesome. We've got lots of thumbs ups and lots of really great conversation going on in the chat. So thank you, everybody, and we will engage and continue there today. Remember, we said this, we were going to break this into 3 chunks, right? And I will tell you, this first chunk is the one that frustrated me the most in my own personal journey, but also has been some of the most important work that I have been doing. So let's start out with building the foundation. There's so many different ways in which you can explore this. We've only got an hour here, but we're going to spend a good amount of time on this first section. So let's talk about why it is that For example, Jess and I grew up with two very different sets of thinking around what's respectful. Right? So this is Bobby Harrow's Cycle of Socialization. Jess, could you tee up what this is, and then you and I can each go into our stories here?
Yeah, so the cycle of socialization, when someone said this is pervasive in everything, right? Like this is why, right? There are things that have become norms or standards of being that we don't even know. They're that we are cognitive to the fact that they're happening, but we've been socialized or sort of trained through our experiences with other people, through our experiences with institutions, to know what is normal and what is the standard, right? So this process or this framework kind of teaches us on how we learn that those pervasive inequities, right? So what Megan and I are going to do here is kind of walk through some of our own socialization so that we can see how nuanced we had to peel back in order to understand why we might have some of those unconscious biases around other groups.
Awesome. So let's take a look, and we're going to start at this beginning spot here. And I'm going to grab my pen. Actually, I'm going to make a mess if I grab my pen because we're going around this twice. All right. So imagine if we're in this light blue on the left side, about 8:30, 9 o'clock on the clock with the beginning, right? Little Megan is growing up in very, very, very white, very, very, very Christian, right, very what I thought of, to be honest, as traditional America, right? There isn't a lot of diversity going around. The only thing I've noticed, right, as a child of diversity, there's some boys and there's some girls, right? And I was, right, then framed, right? My parents said, Megan, girls can do anything boys can do. You just got to work hard at it, right? And so that was some of my early, right, what was told to me about my first socialization around my point of difference in the world, right? So I go into school, I go into church, I go into my community. And what I find is that when I work really, really hard, that gets noticed and I get ahead, right? That's the enforcement on that, right? It's a reinforcing, right, behavioral cycle. I do really well, I get great results, I get, right, access to the next thing. It looks like a meritocracy, right? And it works like that in that space, right? And then I get results. Okay? And so because of that, right, as long as I'm getting the good results I want, my actions would continue to be, right, along that same cycle. Where if I didn't have an opportunity for something to happen and jar me out of my existence, in which if you just work really hard, girls can do anything boys can do. And yes, I do understand that that's a very binary framing. And I grew up with a very binary framing, right? And so that would lead me to not do a lot of things that were very different unless I had some sort of action that jarred me loose, that took me on a direction for change. So we're not going to talk about that whole process, because I think what's really important right now is to take a look and a listen for how that cycle works differently from somebody else's perspective.
Yep. And I appreciate, it's like a reinforcing behavioral cycle. I appreciate that perspective, Megan. So the beginning is like where you're born, you know nothing, right? Like you didn't learn, you didn't just come into the world believing some of the biases that we hold, right? There were things that we had to be taught through our first socialization. So me, I am lucky enough to be multiracial. I have a white mother and a Black father. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my socialization around my race. So one of my first socializations as a Black child in a white family was learning to swim. And my grandfather he lived on a river in Michigan, northern Michigan. And when they taught me to swim, they just Like every other grandchild, they just throw us off the dock and like you're in a life vest and you learn to swim. And I picked it up really quickly. I'm a really strong swimmer. And my grandfather's response to that was, okay, that's my grandchild. She can't be Black. So what I learned about my racial identity from my white family in that moment was that I can't be Black in order to be loved and accepted in this family, right? So, and B, that tells me that there's something wrong with being Black. So one of my first socializations was that my race was bad, right? And then I grew up in Detroit, which is a predominantly Black city. And I was public school educated. And what we know about our institutions in the city of Detroit is that they statistically are underperforming, right, when compared to the other aspects of the state. And so the other school districts in the state. And so the other way that I'm reinforced around my race, like, hey, this is the largest concentration of Black people in the state of Michigan. It's also the most underperforming institutions around education. So one other way that I'm learning, and this is reinforced in my institutions, is that, hey, we aren't good. We aren't as good, right? We go into other enforcements. Those are things like, what are the systems, policies, norms that we're seeing around racial identity? We want to talk about the criminal justice system. We want to talk about our healthcare system. We want to talk about all of these ways that this socialization around Black is bad is reinforced in our culture. Like those are carrying, that messaging is carrying through, right? So the results are, I either start to believe that Black is bad, right? Or I take action to educate myself and kind of unpack that. So what this cycle of socialization does is it's teaching us some of those stereotypes and standards that kind of continue to exclude and marginalize certain groups. And what we get the opportunity to do in that action section is we can do nothing, which I'm not like, the reason why we do nothing a lot of times is because we're scared. That core in the center is really grounded in fear. We don't know what to do. We don't want to shake things up. We're comfortable with the status quo. But what we get the divine opportunity to do, especially in L&D, where our work gets to touch literally everybody in the organization, is to take a direction towards change. And that's what we hope that you can take from today is one strategy, one resource, one tool where that leads you towards a direction of change in your own organizations and for yourself. So let's hop into talking about social identity, right? We're centering this conversation on race, and race is one of those categories. So social identity is a way to relate to one another. Social identities are the categories and the experiences that grows daily, right? Like this list isn't exhaustive. There are some social identity groups that exist today that probably didn't exist when I was in college or Megan was in college or even 10 years ago, right? Social identity is not static. And that means that the groupings we affiliate with or associate with, not all of them, but some of them can change. For example, you might not be in the same social economic status that you were when you were a child, or maybe as you've grown in your own self-acceptance and self-awareness and your interactions with people, your groupings or categories don't fit you anymore, right? I didn't come out as queer until I graduated college. So those are social identities that have changed. But social identity plays a role in the level of influence or access we have, right? Because there are certain social identity groups which have been historically centered and upheld and normalized and standardized in our culture over time. And there are other groupings and categories that have been disenfranchised, marginalized, and excluded. So there is a power differential when we're talking about social identity. And this power differential makes social identity something that can be experienced. And that means that it could become more or less salient in certain contexts and environments. For example, when I walk into a room of all men, my gender might become very salient to me, like, oh, I identify as a woman, right? And this imbalance can also cause a compounded impact, right? Meaning I could have a very different experience in that room if it's all men, and let's say it's majority white men. I might have a very different experience as a woman of color than, let's say, Megan, who's also a woman, but presents as a white woman. Her level of comfort and access and credibility might be different in that space. So when we're talking about social identity, we want you to know that it's not static. It can change. The list that we talk about today also can change. It's not exhaustive. And it is an experience. It's something that can be experienced because we've given it power in society and in our culture.
So I love me a good tool. And so we provided a tool for you. Here's a link in the chat that you can use. You don't have to use it now. We're not going to have time to do it together. And I'd like you to have the opportunity to take some time, maybe this weekend, maybe over holiday. Some of us have holiday coming up, to take a look at this. But this is big stuff Jess is talking about. And what I like about this tool is it allows for the opportunity to break it down and take a look and really reflect on how your identities and how our identities create both barriers to success and access to success. And then given that, what we can do with it. So here's how this works, right? So there are a number of social identity types down the left-hand side. And like Jess said, the list is changing, the terminology is changing, the list is growing, and we leave you a few blanks at the end to take a look. So this is just a snippet, but make this your own, right? And then in the second column to the left, you take a look at what your membership in that particular group is. So I identify as a female, right? I am white. When I got to ethnicity, I'm like, I don't know. This struck me as a difficult question because it never occurred to me, because I just check off non-Hispanic wherever I go, right? There's only two options, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Right? And I never really had, until this, spent a lot of time thinking about what my ethnicity was, right? And so you go down the list and you think about, right, I just turned 50 last year, so I'm very aware of my generation. I am physically able, but I spend a lot of time thinking about neurodiversity because my daughter is autistic, right? And so when I see physical ability, the first thing that comes up to me is, where's the neurodiversity? Don't worry, it's further down on the list, right? So then we move across, right? What are we most aware of in our daily life? And what are we least aware of, right? These areas, by the way, where we are least aware can be the areas in which we're most likely to have perception gaps or even biases, right? The areas that I feel I'm most aware of and affect how others think of me are the areas in which I'm most likely to be touchy, right? Or most likely to feel harm when it happens. And then there are a number of spaces that create access for me. So I will tell you that by being a woman in a technical space, even though I'm not a software developer, right? I have had access to opportunities when a panel is created, a speaker lineup is created, because in order to balance, we need to make sure that we are representing women. And so I have, in my early years, gotten access as a result. And you know what I do with that access? Is I make sure I bring other people along. Right? So that not only creates access for me, but it is a power base in which I can help others if I choose. So some of you may look at this and say, I kind of resonate with this way of being in the world. And some of you may say, my gosh, this doesn't seem like me at all. So let's take a look at a different map. Jess?
Yeah, and I love this co-facilitation model, right? Like, we're intentional about who's on stage with us today, right? Megan and I hold very different experiences intentionally. So when you look at my social identity matrix, or my exploration, my gender identity, I identify as fluid and femme. I am biracial, and I center my racial identity on my Black identity. Ethnicity, I do put that I am US American, and I used to call out, because this is an opportunity to call out where folks have access to privilege here. My ancestors were captured and brought over unwillingly, and I don't know where they come from. Although I just got my ancestry, I am mostly Congolese and English. So I don't know much about those groups though. So I still identify as American. I'm spiritual. I am solidly middle class. I am millennial. And I identify as temporary able-bodied because I recognize that my physical ability status can change at any point. I could be in a head-on collision, which I recently was, and lose my mobility. There are lots of things that could change that. So I always identify as temporarily there. I'm very aware of my gender, race, and sexual orientation. And I think that that's because that affects how people think about me. I am from the Midwest, so my sexual orientation has been pretty salient in my relationships here in the Midwest. It's very different than the East Coast, which is where my wife and I secretly got married years ago. And I also think that can create some barriers for me. And when it comes to areas that I gain access, my age, I think, gives me some positionality. If I was able to put something else on this list, I speak in a very standard English, right? Like I'm not using African-American vernacular English, or I'm really good at code switching, right? And I think that gives me access. The way that I speak, the manner in which I speak gives me access to spaces because it feels closer in proximity to that majority or that dominant culture, right? So when I think about my identities, a lot of my identities, because of this power differential that we talked about over time, have presented lots of barriers because the identities that I hold have not been historically centered. My queer identity has not been historically centered or normalized. My Black identity has not been historically centered or normalized. My femme fluidity has not been historically centered or normalized. So when I walk through the world, I am constantly thinking about how do I fit in automatically, because of who I am wasn't the standard or the norm that was created, right, in the ones that we're following. So when we think about cultivating equity, we have to think about how we're challenging some of those standards of that status quo. And this is a great tool. We can go on to debriefing this tool. It's a great tool to use with your team, to have these conversations, just to talk about how our differences and experiences have impacted us in our work, right? There is a different level of, one of the conversations that Megan and I had early on was, our office space is in Chelsea, Michigan, which is not, I'm in Detroit, like I live in Detroit. It's about 53 minutes west of Detroit. It's a very rural, mostly white environment. And I would tell her, like, in the morning when I'm driving at 7 in the morning, I'm not a morning person. I listen to my music really loud, and I listen to my music, right? And when I would get to Chelsea, I would automatically turn the music down. And that was just something that I did. And so when I think about how social identity affects how you present in work, I'm thinking about how much of yourself do you have to turn down in order to feel credible? Thanks for calling that out, Liz. In order to feel worthy, in order to be successful in your workplace. So this tool can help you start those conversations. I would say, with the caveat that it's not an easy conversation to just have, especially if your team doesn't have a lot of rapport. But some debriefing things that you can think about as you're using this tool is, how did it feel to talk about vulnerability, like how your identity has presented opportunities and access for you versus maybe how it has presented barriers for other people. How does that connect to your role in L&D? What opportunities do you notice for L&D to respond? Has it created barriers in your career trajectory that we can kind of help fill those gaps? And then what about those intersectional experiences? What does it mean to be a queer woman of color at all of those intersections, or a middle-class European descendant woman, right? Like what are all those intersections doing? And then how can you help use this tool with other people to increase their awareness? So this is a really great tool for your team to open up some of that space, and build that awareness around how social identity can create opportunities, barriers, and perpetuate that exclusion that we're trying to really change.
And so I'm going to pause here just for a moment, right? For two reasons. One, I want to address some of the questions that have come into the Q&A. And two, this self-awareness is a big piece. It's why we've spent a large piece of it in the session. But we do have some actions. So, Kristen, to your question about what are some of the tactics we can use, we are about to get to tactics, right? We are about to get to tactics. In fact, take a look at this. Take action is next. So I'm with you, right? The self-awareness, to me, it was like, okay, great, but now I'm really uncomfortable. Now I really want to do something with this knowledge. Katrina asked, does age count as a social identity? Absolutely, right? And so that's absolutely one of the rows that you can use to navigate through. And there were some comments in the chat around how these things can, these aspects of our social identity can vary over time. Age is exactly one of them, right? Ability status is another one. We just created a course on invisible disabilities, and some of the metrics there are amazing. Right? There's a lot of us, many of us will become disabled in some capacity during our work lives, right? So there's lots going on, right? What I want to do is I want to focus, because these are big structural things. And sometimes it can feel like boiling the ocean. So what I really want to do is take action and talk about this in your span of influence today. Because in learning and development, we have a really unique opportunity and a pretty impressive span of influence within our organizations. We touch every employee. We may even touch every customer with our work. We have the opportunity to take a lens on that work that can uplift instead of reinforcing some historical patterns. And there's a really, really cool thing here, right? So as Rubina said, we are learning leaders, and we are leaders through the learning that we do about ourselves and that we provide to others, right? So some of you may be familiar with my work in Agile project management, and for instructional design, there's a heavy overlap with design thinking for instructional design contexts. And some of the work that we've been doing in this area is to take our classic learner personas, right, and then take another pass through that activity, considering what areas of social identity may be impacting how people come to that learning experience. Right? What affects their motivation? What creates access or barriers for them? And then what can we do in order to address that? And so this became a really useful tool. Several of our clients have really dug deep on this because it's provided such a really interesting lens here. And you know, like, look at the bottom here. We can keep adding different clients in different situations have different areas of social identity that are more salient to them. But let's talk a little bit more broadly and very tactically here. And so we're going to share with you some of the images and media, right? So a lot of us deal with, whether you're building e-learning or instructor-led training, right? We deal with images and media a lot. And so that's a space that we can very, very quickly take action on. And what Jess and I did was we went through our stock libraries and came up with some opportunities for growth. So about 4 years ago, and I'm going to have Jess tell you what's wrong with this, but about 4 years ago, I was really excited to find this. because I needed a bunch of different avatars for a course I was building. And I was so excited to see just how diverse this was and how easy these were going to be to slot into my course and have an instant diversity sparkle to it. Jess, what was I missing?
And I want to name, like, this moment is really important. Megan is our CEO at Torrance Learning, and she is publicly naming a misstep that she has made 4 years ago, right? And this is one of the key elements of DEIB. We got to be ready to own our mistakes. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means we're all in here to grow. And I think that as learning leaders, we know that learning means we're growing. So here we see that, like, although there are different hues of color represented, the baseline image is standard and set on a homogeneous look and feel, right? We see very similar hair textures, we see very similar nose shapes, very similar lip fullness, very similar eye shapes. This has set whiteness as the standard, right? And there are other features that could better characterize the Black aesthetic. So like I mentioned, the texture of hair, the nose, or other features of melanated perspectives. And so when we have one set of images that all kind of conform to a white aesthetic, and we just put a tan on the faces, is that actually inclusion? Or are we creating equity, or are we kind of still maintaining that status quo of white as the baseline and the standard? So as you think about reflecting diversity, think about what diversity actually looks like. Think about how you can work with diverse artists that can reflect their community. Think about the differences in hue. Even here, the three different hues are still pretty light in terms of the melanin. Can we include more darker perspectives? And so this is an opportunity to really shake up that standardization of whiteness.
And in the chat, right? I love the conversation in the chat, right? They're all thin. They're all they're all right. So there are no hijabs, right? There's so many things that we are missing here, right? And so we could do this all day. Let's do another one. So Jess, what do you see when you look at this picture?
Yeah, and I appreciate all of the comments and the resources being shared in the chat. Thanks, everyone. So I think a lot of times when we're looking for groups or working or teams, we want to have that diversity reflected, right? And what we can see here is we're sort of focused in on a younger looking woman of color in the center there. But what is this actually communicating what we hope diversity communicates? Like, what is the point of having diverse representation in our media? My hope would be it is to create equitable representation. It is to like challenge some of the stigmas and stereotypes of diversity, right? And here we still have who's the leader in terms of positionality, in terms of facilitating the conversation. It probably wouldn't be this woman of color. My assumption and Megan's assumption is that it might be the man in the collared shirt where everyone's looking, or the man at the front of the room. So is this image actually challenging any stereotype or status quo that is exclusionary? From my perspective, I would say no. I think that this is an example of tokenism. She doesn't have a laptop. It's not conveying that she has influence or power in the situation based on how she's positioned. It also isn't showing that she's contributing. And in one presentation, someone said she kind of looks like an intern, right? So it's again putting her in a very lower position. And then some of the other critiques that we've seen of this image is how our difference in presentation and clothing in style being addressed, right? This all is very monotone and conforms to a very subtle hue, right? And so those are things. And then also she's she's pretty light skinned. And as a person who is light skinned and recognizes that I get more access because I have closer proximity to whiteness because of my light skin status, I have privilege there. I recognize that. I own that. How are we including other folks that are further away from that white proximity? So those are some of my thoughts. What are you thinking about this, Megan? Or did you want to move on to the next image? I'm just
Let's
looking
move
at
on to the next one. You covered the power dynamics, right? So
Yeah.
and it's interesting, right? So actually, I am going to pause here for a moment, right? So I spend a lot of my energy around gender dynamics. So I see men as the leaders here. Jess spends a lot of her energy around racial dynamics, and she sees the tokenism of the Black woman here, right? And so what's interesting about this, right, is and where this we're going to hint into the third section here, and I know we've only got a few more minutes, but the having a variety of perspectives to review your work can help you to identify some of those perception gaps and design that in from the start. Jess, this one is actually one of my favorites, and we're all going to have a field day on this one.
Yeah, I think that we have a kind of a baseline knowledge of what you shouldn't do and how you shouldn't put people in stereotypical positions, right, in our scenarios. And so I was looking Adobe Stock. I searched like theft at the office. And when you look there were no people of color as the folks committing the theft. There just wasn't. It was mostly white presenting people who were committing the theft. As you can see here, it's a white man doing whatever he's stealing from the office, right? But on the same, I don't know the thing that I'm trying to say there, but I then searched for like tech teams, right? Which is a positive experience, right? It's not a stereotype. Tech teams could be anyone, anybody could be a part of a tech team. And what came up was a team that looks like it's mostly white people. So as you're thinking about those scenarios, yes, I'm sure that we all have been trained to be critical of how we're positioning folks from marginalized identities in scenarios that perpetuate stereotypes. But are we also positioning people from marginalized identities or people of color in positive depictions? Are we also normalizing the positive depictions of those groups? So that's a question that we noticed here. So make sure that you're challenging some of those stereotypical and racist depictions, but also being inclusive in the positive and affirmative depictions as well.
So media, right? The imagery and the media is, we use these in whether it's self-paced e-learning, whether it's live sessions or virtual sessions. Media is in our marketing, right? Media is everywhere. There's some things that you can do interpersonally when you are leading a group as an instructor or a facilitator or simply organizing a meeting. And some of these are familiar, right? Make a point to pronounce people's names correctly. Don't shorten them to something that's convenient for you to pronounce, right? Don't that's we all want to be seen as who we are, right? But when you do goof up, don't do oh my gosh, like I'm so sorry, I'm going to get this better, I promise you I'm going to get this better, I'm going to, like I've seen people fall all over themselves in an effort, a well-intended effort to convey just how much they care about getting it right, but they end up centering themselves and making everybody feel far more awkward. So this is one you correct yourself, you apologize, you make it better, and you move on, right? I love that comment, right, Rubina, right? If I get your name, you can say my name, right? We're affirming people's contributions. And as the facilitator, right, you're also paying attention to whose contributions are being made, right? You're paying attention to who's speaking and who's not speaking, and whose contributions you are acknowledging, right? So make sure that you are attending to that, right? A lot of this takes a lot of self-awareness. When we set up breakout groups, it may be very tempting if you have a small number of people who are from historically marginalized identities, to sprinkle them around. So there's, for example, I'm going to put one person of color in every single breakout group. The problem is what you've done is you've then isolated them and tokenized them and put them in a position of lower power relative to those groups possibly, and perhaps not been able to build some of the strength that comes from in being in numbers, right? So really pay attention to the design of the human interactions in there. Jess, do you want to jump in on the the pronouns?
Yeah, so I think that in an attempt to be very inclusive of where people are in their gender identity journey, we've started normalizing the use of pronouns, right? It helps folks who might not have the historically centered way of expressing their gender. It invites that conversation in, but there's also can be a an adverse effect, right, on the inclusion of folks. For example, if I'm not ready to come out or talk about being gender fluid, and I'm still in my own journey around that, forcing me to identify with a gender can force me to lie about where I'm at, or it can be triggering. So you can ask for pronouns. You can also be intentional about not asking for pronouns. You can set it up so that folks can choose how they want to engage, and you can name why you're doing that, right? But really, including pronouns is a practice that can facilitate more inclusion, but it can also be harmful depending on where people are in their journey. So making sure you're considering those is going to be really helpful there.
So let's talk about kind of as leaders, as project managers, as designers, and as influencers, both at work and in your communities. A quick starting place. This has been a fantastic fantastic conversation. There's so many more questions in the chat that we'll have to answer in chat as opposed to here. But also that some of those, for example, Emily, some of the questions that you've got are answered in the resource guide, as well as we have a whole course on handling microaggressions. So Jess, can you talk about the checklist that's in the download?
Yeah, so Megan put in the chat a resource guide that you can download, and one of the biggest things that I hope you use is a checklist to help you think about different aspects of your work and how you can ensure that you're making considerations for equity, right? So we're thinking about interpersonal relationship activities, we're thinking about systems and processes, we're thinking about culture. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of ways. I love how it's pervasive across everything. That's what we try to do. We try to break down everything that we do and how can we think about equity across all of the things that we do, and what are some of those prompts and reflection. Kristen, to answer your question around how do you tactfully think about this, one of the resources that we've been offering clients and that folks have been asking for is a Q&A process for DEI subject matter expertise, right? So someone who is reviewing your work from the lens of DEI, the same way we have copywriters and copy editors reviewing for grammar and typos, we can be reviewing for bias and microaggressions in our work as well. And so that has become a more on-demand ask of clients, even for us right now, but also thinking about how you're growing your team, what resources and vendors you're working with, how are you choosing how ready are you to engage in these conversations? Are you ready for someone to name that, hey, that actually triggered me, or that doesn't feel the most inclusive, and what can you be doing to do that? But that full checklist and those questions to consider are in that resource guide that Megan put in the chat.
So the structure that we talked about today has actually been is actually the structure of a curriculum that we've developed. We that is, we have both a curriculum that's L&D focused as well as a curriculum that is learner focused, right? Employee focused within the organization, and we're actually getting a lot of traction there. So I wanted to call out the excellent work that Jess and the Torrance Learning team have done on this curriculum, as well as some of the opportunities that we have for continued learning around this. We would love to connect up with you and continue the conversation, and we'll be in and out at the conference throughout the day. But as you reflect on this, and before you zip off to the next thing, just take a moment and consider where you are in your own space and how that might impact and influence how you engage with the rest of the conference today. So I want to thank all of you very much. I'm guessing that Louise will come back on stage in a moment to close us out here and move us all on to the next thing. And I want to thank you for this really great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you all for engaging. I see lots of questions in the chat, and I'll be attempting to answer some. But thank you all for your engagement and for all of your contributions in the chat. I love this.